All right, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure and also a terrible feeling to be here to moderate this panel discussion on geographical perspectives on the Russian war in Ukraine. And this is going to be a rather traditional panel. We're going to first have an introduction by myself, after which I will be leaving the words to our four panelists. Now, first of all, let's allow the panelists to introduce themselves first. So, Valeria Lazarenko.
Thank you, Michael. It's a pleasure for me to be here. I'm Valeria Lazarenko from Ukraine. Today is exactly 3 months as I left my home country because of the full-scale war that started on 24th February 2022. Now I'm based in Aachen, near Berlin, in Leibniz Institute for Research on Society and Space. And there my topic of research is the feelings and experiences of Ukrainian migrants, displaced people who are now living in Germany. Before that, I had my PhD done about the experiences of internally displaced people. And now I became a displaced researcher studying displacement. And so I'll pass the word to the next speaker.
Thank you, Valeria. My name is Anastasia Bobrova. I work in Ukrainian Kyiv-based think tank. I mostly work with issues of urban transformations and housing policy. So today I will talk a little bit about that as well.
Thanks. My name is Kostyantyn Mezentsev. I hope some of you know me. I'm head of Department of Economic and Social Geography at Taras Shevchenko Kyiv National University. And I am involved into a research project on Ukrainian geopolitical cities, cold line cities, urban identity, geopolitics, and urban policy. Therefore, I hope we will talk about this aspect, and with my main focus on IDPs, and also I would like to talk about IDPs today as well.
Welcome to everyone. My name is Katalin Kovály, or Katalin Kovály, more in Ukrainian. I am working in Budapest at Institute of Geography, the former Academy of Science, the former name. Now it is an Eötvös Loránd research network, and I am here, I guess, because I was born in Ukraine, in Transcarpathia. This is the westernmost region of Ukraine, and the field of expertise, or my expertise, is Transcarpathia and the Hungarian minority in Transcarpathia. And thank you very much.
So thank you very much to the panelists that you've gotten acquainted with. I might also disclose that my own name is Michael Gentile, in case you're wondering. I think I didn't tell you that before. Now, before we start, let it be known that the panel's agreed position is that we extremely strongly condemn every single action that the Russian Federation has been doing in relation to this war, which, let us remember, did not start on the 24th of February, but a lot earlier. Now, that said, let me just clarify some things here. We're going to have our panel presentations first, or panel talks first. They will be recorded, after which we will open up for questions and answers. The questions and answers session will not be recorded for reasons related to the potential sensitivity of the topic. So you do not have to fear leaving traces of your questions and contributions to this panel, at least in this form. And for this reason, I also kindly ask all of you not to record the session yourselves in case you're tempted to do so. That also applies to live tweeting, for example. Any kind of live presence on social media is not welcome at the moment, because we want to be able to speak as freely as possible on a theme that is potentially problematic. Now, I will start this panel by saying a few words about what this war is about and what it's not about. And let me start by citing a very famous geographer, David Harvey. And he said in his so-called preliminary remarks about the war in Ukraine, I can't remember the exact title of his contribution, he said, in the 1990s, it appeared as if NATO was a military alliance in search of an enemy. Putin has now been provoked enough to oblige, obviously angered by the humiliation of Russia's economic treatment as a basket case and Western dismissive arrogance as to Russia's place in the global order. Harvey could hardly have missed any point in the Russian propaganda about this war. These are the traditional talking points. NATO is in search of an enemy. Putin was provoked, even though, let us not forget that NATO increased in its number of members significantly the last time in 2004. Yes, Montenegro was added later on, but let's face it, that's not a strategic threat to the Russian Federation. Then the point about the humiliation of Russia, about the economic treatment of Russia, the imposed neoliberalism which permeates the rest of Harvey's contribution. But that was also a very long time ago. That's 30 years ago. And so suddenly now Russia's humiliated. And also, of course, Russia's place in the global order. So let me make a few points about what this war is about and what it's not about. We'll start with what it is not about. First of all, it's not about NATO expansion. Had it been about NATO expansion, well, perhaps more of a reaction would have taken place earlier. Yes, there was a reaction, of course, but it was frankly no real big deal. It's not about Ukrainian possible membership in 10 or 20 years. It's not also about Russian so-called legitimate security concerns. That's not what it's about. It's not about the far right, the Azov regiments, the Ukrainian Nazis, nationalists, Banderovites, you name it. It's not about that. It's also not about the discrimination or the cultural genocide of Russians and Russian speakers in Ukraine. We've heard a lot about this, but that's not what it's about. It's of course not about the genocide of Russians and Russian speakers in the Donbass, also one of the main talking points in Russian propaganda, nor is it about Russophobia, which is a term repeated as a mantra if you watch Russian television. All of these are false pretexts. As with all propagandistic communication, some of them build on a grain of truth, but there's a very, very big difference between a grain and a beach. What is it about then? It's about territorial conquest, first and foremost. It's about imperial recolonization. It's about the denial of the existence and of the legitimacy of Ukraine. It's about the destruction of the Ukrainian economy, of its society, of its culture, of its demographics, including through genocidal acts. So if we talk about a genocide of Russian speakers, it is starting to take place now on behalf of other, presumably, for the most part, Russian speakers serving the interests of the Russian Federation. And it's, last but not least, about the gathering of expendable human capital, of people that can be deported and used as cheap, perhaps involuntary labor in places around Russia or also within the occupied territories. So that is pretty much what I wanted to say by way of introduction. And at this point, I would like to pass the word over to our first panelist, Valeria Lazarenko. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. I would pick up the floor after what you said and the point you have briefly mentioned about decolonization. Because through the last 30 years of Ukrainian independence, there were lots of talks of Ukraine was like considerably treated as a post-socialist state. And so the lens of a post-socialist research was applied to what was happening in Ukrainian society before the start of the full-scale war. But recent events have proven that Ukraine is not only a post-socialist state, but also a post-colonial state. And post-colonial optics can be applied to Ukrainian society and Ukraine as state as a whole. And because the process of what is happening right now is Russia denying Ukraine the subjectivity and the right to existence, and the Russian propagandistic narrative implying that Ukraine doesn't exist as a separate cultural and separate thing, that it is just a piece of a whole big Russia. Like the narrative that is spoken refers to the term Malorossiya, meaning little Russia. This is a term that was heavily used about in 19th century, actually, when Ukraine was still most of the territories of Ukraine were still part of huge Russian Empire. And what we are talking about now, what we are rediscovering as Ukrainian society now, is the very idea that we not only have a strong need to get rid of the Soviet past and the Soviet heritage, but we also need to overcome our imperial past. Our past as a colonial state that was colonized not only for the last 70 years of 20th century, but also for almost 400 years before. And in this occasion, this discussion about decolonization is finally coming on the society level. From the small talks of public intellectuals, philosophers who were like George Grabovich, Mykola Repchuk, who were talking about Ukraine as a post-colonial state back in 1990s and early 2000s, now this discourse comes over to a society level. So, like, Minister of Culture is talking about our self-assessment as a post-colonial state. Public leaders, opinion leaders are mentioning this idea of being post-colonial state. And what I can observe right now is that Ukrainians are finally not ashamed of calling ourselves as a post-colonial state. And this lens can be quite useful to think about what is happening on societal level. I haven't mentioned before, I'm not a geographer, but I'm a psychologist, so I'm more interested in people and what is happening on a societal level. And so the last events have been a major cause for Ukrainians to think about what does it mean to be Ukrainian. What does Ukrainian identity actually means, what it consists of. And we might say that 30 years ago, when Ukrainian gained independence in 1991, we already had this idea that Ukraine is a separate nation. And so the public voting about Ukrainian independence in December 1991 was the sense was slightly more than 90% of people voting in favor of Ukraine to be an independent country. But what was the meaning of being Ukrainian back in that time? The last 30 years were the years while Ukrainian society was building, trying to find some references and to build Ukrainian identity. But after facing an extreme threat from a foreign country that are basically denying our right to exist as a separate political and cultural nation, what Russia did to Ukrainian society was the strongest effort of uniting Ukrainians, the strongest possible effort to make us think who we are And the first question is, we are Ukrainians, we are not Russians, we are not like them. Because we are separate, we have our own culture, and our identity is grounded on defending our culture and our rights of existence. That was a thing that was typical for like 17 years old, 17th century national uprising. Actually, it's happening again. We are redefining ourselves as who we are. And an organization, Ukraine Kiev-based think tank CEDOS, with which I am affiliated, has made a survey in the beginning, in the first 2 weeks of the war, full-scale war, we made a survey about the experiences, thoughts, and actions of Ukrainians in these days. And we had there a question about how did your life views changed since the beginning of the war. And one of the major tendencies in our responses concerned that people mentioned that they finally acknowledged themselves as Ukrainians, that their Ukrainian identity was really fortified by the existential threat of Russians. People started thinking about themselves firstly as Ukrainians, and all other identities were on the second, went to the background. And this understanding ourselves as Ukrainians manifested on different levels, from wearing clothes that are referring to our is to be united with other Ukrainians, with other people, with mutual experiences of hearing the air raid sirens like this one. Because this is what Ukrainians who are still in the country hear every day, every single day. And this mutual experience and mutual fight for our existence is what unites us now. And also another important issue is that Ukrainians are finally realizing being Ukrainian is also becoming a trend in Europe and in other countries. Being Ukrainian, it's becoming fancy for many people in Western Europe, in Western world, who really appreciate Ukrainians as, on one hand, brave people, on the other hand, poor people who are suffering and who are needing their help. But also, the recent events of the recent 3 months has proven that also being Ukrainian now is somehow expressing a sense of solidarity with other people who share mutual experience with you. And in my previous research, I was working with internally displaced people from Donbass who moved to Ukrainian cities since the war started in 2014. And the question of what is it for them to be Ukrainian in that time was a matter of choice. Because in the situation when there was a separatist Russian attack, basically Russian-inspired separatist attack on these self-proclaimed republics, people have chosen to be Ukrainians. And they reported to me that their relocation to other parts of Ukraine happened not because, mostly because they wanted to be with Ukraine. And they always refer to the occupied parts of our country as Ukrainian cities and with Ukrainian people still living there. And now we also have this, and I might say that internally displaced people from Donbass on some occasions seemed to me as people expressing the strongest and the most radical Ukrainian identity. Because for them, it was a matter of existence. And right now, for the whole country, being Ukrainian is an existential question. Being Ukrainian means to resist and to persist and to believe in a future Ukraine that will be peaceful and restored in its official borders. I think I'll stop at this point and pass the floor to Kostyantyn Mezentsev, who will speak more about displacement and migration.
Yeah, thank you, Valeria. Maybe the most essential challenge for Ukraine's future is mass displacement. And I would like to talk about 7 points concerning this issue. Point 1, numbers. According to different assessment, 5-8 millions of refugees and about 7-8 IDPs from Ukraine or in Ukraine. It's really a huge number, and 3.5 million, approximately 3.5 million, are with official status of refugees, temporary protection, under temporary protection different programs. Point 2, biased structure of IDPs. What I mean? First of all, higher share of female, mostly young female, with children, and people 60 plus. These two categories are consist more the main share of the main part of refugee. And other aspect very important. Mostly they are refugees with higher level of education, more qualified specialists. It's really essential challenge and for future Ukraine. Point 3, where just 3 countries, Poland, Germany, and Czech Republic, hosted 2.5 million refugees from, or asylum seekers from Ukraine. At the same time, Russia, 1.3 million, also up, not exact figures, but especially children, especially forcibly removed from Ukraine. It's essential part of new generation of Ukrainians that are forcibly removed from our country. Concerning IDPs, mostly Western Ukraine and city of Kyiv and some larger cities in Ukraine, close to Western border, in compare with previous period. Point 4, back to 2014. In 2014, it was approximately 1.5 million IDPs in Ukraine. And very interesting, it was multi-level special pattern of IDPs. What I mean? In national scale, mostly in the eastern part, closely to occupied areas, and in the capital city and nearest suburbia. At the second level, mostly large cities. For example, cities with a population 100 plus hosted 45 IDPs. At the same time, they cover 35% of population. In particular, 4 cities, Severodonetsk, Kramatorsk, Slovyansk, and Mariupol, are characterized by such feature. More than 200 IDPs per 1,000 locals. It's a really huge number. And now most of these IDPs experienced the second displacement, the next trauma for them, next level, inside cities. Usually in many media and other sources talk about visible IDPs. What I mean, who live in compact so-called transit settlements, transit towns, that was constructed in 2014-15 for maximum 3 years, but they continue to live there for now, who removed to this temporary wagons and very interesting aspect. Most of such temporary settlements are on the outskirts of the city, as some kind of part of islands in the city. Try to not see in the city as these islands of trauma, islands of victimization, and so on. But really, this visible IDPs consist only 1.5% of all IDPs. Most of them are disseminated around the city, as some of our respondents in interviews answered that мы размазаны тонким шаром по всей территории міста. Мы размазаны тонким слоем по всей территории города. We smeared by thin layer around the city. And next level, for example, in the city Dnipro, if you look on different districts in the city, for example, in central districts, Soborny, Centralny, concentration of IDP 2 times higher than in comparison with industrial districts. Also, some differences. Because many of IDPs from Donetsk and this region were with approximately higher incomes, and they prefer to live in more comfortable situation, and at the same time they give new push to development of new cities for them, or the cities where they can back. Point 5, return intention. We conducted many interviews with returnee to Kramatorsk, and returnee intention depends on duration of the war. Now, most of IDPs and refugees talk about we are ready to go back. Overwhelming majority of them are ready to go back. But our interview shows that most of them changed this vision after 7 years from 2014, when really war started. And different explanation. And as for me, important narratives about to go back where? To go back to the city or to go back to the home? And most of them reject to go back to the city. Why? Because firstly, to go to the city, that was changed essentially. To go to the city from what you left earlier. Other very sensitive question, to go back to the city where we consider it as traitors for them who stay there, who abuse them, that you take intellectual potential, or you not stay to defend our homeland, and so on. And other aspect, some of them, some of returnees say, IDPs say that we are ready to go back to our city, but in case of to restore justice, to restore legality with punitive aim. And just one small part of our respondents talk about to go back to home, but in some condition, under some condition, if it will be as before 2014, if I can sell my home, my house here, or if I can take my home from that city and to take it with me to new city. Point 6. Point 6. To go back where? It's priority number 1 for Ukraine now, and I also a member of one working group of National Council who deals with strategy of restoring Ukraine, regeneration Ukraine in post-war period. And priority number 1, to bring IDPs and refugees back to Ukraine, back to their homes. But to where homes they will be back? Is it possible to bring them to urbicide areas? 1/3 of Ukrainian city are urbicide. I mean shelling, bombing, street fighting, and so on. to which city? Many Ukrainian cities are now not really city. In fact, for example, Popasna, Volnovakh, and many Mariupol and so on. It's not city. They are not city anymore, unfortunately. And other side, to go back to small city, is it possible to find jobs there now? Because in this process under war, we see not just displacement of people, but displacement of jobs, displacement of business. And many businesses, if in 2014 we talk about more small and middle business, now some big enterprises decided to close their offices and their facilities at own city and go back. Therefore, to which jobs they can be back? Or some rural areas, especially on the northern part, closely to border with Russia. Also, this area is really under high risk to have no more people there, just elderly people. And this question is very important to understand to which areas they will be go back. And also other very interesting question concerning occupied cities. Some of our respondents use such phrase as our city is suitcase without handle. It's occupied, but Russia cannot take it to their side, but it's also not be used more for Ukrainian economy. Why? Because most of enterprises was relocated to Russia and no new activities. And who will be that investor who decided to renovate this city? And point 7, military urbicide, ongoing military urbicide. What are the main target? Why Russian military forces destroy our Ukrainian cities? If we look on experience from Bosnia wars, we can see that it was targeted to reject heterogeneity of the city, to reject otherness. Yeah, it's important part to reject heterogeneity because, for example, Mariupol was really multi-ethnical city. And to destroy the city means that not destroy or kill only Ukrainian so-called nationalists or destroy only Ukrainian symbols, all heterogeneous, true heterogeneous city. And at the other side, for example, at the western part of Ukraine, also many multi-ethnical areas now experience a new situation with much more lower tension in between ethnicity. And I think Katerina will talk about this more.
Yes, I will talk about the ethnic minority because Michael asked me to talk about the ethnic minority in Ukraine and how the war affect the ethnic minority in Ukraine and their life. And I will talk about Transcarpathia more in detail because it is a multi-ethnic region, and I think this is an excellent example how the war can change the demographic situation and the whole situation in the region. Where is Transcarpathia? Transcarpathia is the westernmost county of Ukraine, which is bordering with 4 European Union countries, with Poland, Slovakia, Romania, and Hungary, where the considerable number of Hungarian and Romanian minority members are live. And I think it is a very interesting example that procedures which is going on now, it is very unique yes, it is very unique. And what we know, or what's going on now, what we know for sure that since the outbreak of the war, many Hungarians or the member of the Hungarian minority left the country. They escaped from Ukraine, and most of them escaped to Hungary. at this moment, we cannot even give or estimate the number how many Hungarians are escaped from Ukraine, but that means tens of thousands of them. And this is a fact that in Ukraine were held the census only once, and independent Ukraine only once, and it was in 2001, so we don't know the exact number of the Hungarian minorities, but according to the census, to the last census, they are numbered 151,000. Me and my colleagues who are in this room, Agnes Erhös and Patrick Tatrik, made a survey in 2017, and we tried to estimate the actual number of the Hungarian minority, and in 2017, their number was 130,000. So, yes, and we don't know how many Hungarians escaped from Ukraine, I would like to emphasize, but it is very presumably that certainly that the number of Hungarian minorities certainly dropped below 100,000. And I know this is not a huge amount of people, but in comparison with the entire society, it is a huge amount of people, because it can change the ratio and it can change the demographic situation in this region. And what factors are encourage or facilitate this escape of Hungarians? First of all, it was always a very active region, or the people who are living there were very active in the migration, in the labor migration, for example, and it concerns not only the members of the Hungarian community, but the members of the Romanian community and Ukrainian people as well. The second factor that this migration trend began to be more active after the Donbass war, after the Euromaidan event, after 2014. So this procedure started then. And the third factor that the Hungarian community has a very strong ties, very strong relations with the Hungary, with the motherland. Yes, and it is because of, it has some historical reason, and as well this cross-border Hungarian ties very active since 2010 because of the strong in-state politics of Hungary. Yes, they encourage the Hungarian minority who are living abroad, not just in Ukraine, but in Serbia, in Romania, and in Slovakia and in other countries as well. So this is one thing. So many people from the Hungarian community escaped from Ukraine, so they left Ukraine. And what is the other side? Who stayed and who came? I know that many internally displaced persons now stay in the different regions in the western part of Ukraine, in Lvivska Oblast, in Ivano-Frankivska Oblast, but in Transcarpathia there are a lot of internally displaced persons as well, and they came from the very first days of the war to Transcarpathia. And I need to check, but they are, yes, I don't know how many people now here, internally displaced people now in Transcarpathia, but approximately 10% from the entire society or from the entire population of Transcarpathia are internally displaced person. So it is, I think, from the demographical point of view also very important. And yes, in February and on March were many or much more refugees in Transcarpathia, and many of them went back to their city, to their town, but many of them stayed in Transcarpathia because their houses, their apartments were bombed, were destroyed, so they don't have opportunity to come back. And this is also a very, how to say, interesting or very active phenomena that in that part of Transcarpathia where Hungarians are live, or that settlements where Hungarian lives, There are many empty houses. They are for sale because of the migration of the Hungarians, so they left their houses for sale, and this house began to be by Ukrainians or Russian-speaking people. So it can change also the demographic situation in Transcarpathia. And for example, in comparison with the Hungarian community members, Romanians didn't escape from Ukraine. And I don't know the exact reason, but for example, they don't have their so strong relationship with their motherland or with the Romanian country, because Romanian kin state politics is not so strong or not so active as, for example, kin state politics of Hungary. Yes, and one more thing that I saw yesterday your presentation, Valeria, and you show some slides about the survey, how Ukrainian people think about their future, about how they imagine or where they imagine their future, and most of Ukrainians said that they imagine their future in Ukraine and they want to go back. For example, in the case of a Hungarian community, it is not so obvious that they imagine their future after the end of the war in Ukraine, because split families presumably will united not in Ukraine, but mostly in Hungary or in the westernmost part of Europe. Okay, and I'm giving floor to you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. I'm happy to see so many people in here. And today I will talk a little bit about some spatial and social changes that the war brought to Ukraine. And I will start with this all-encompassing issue of housing, because housing is something that now concerns a lot of people. All those who were displaced by the war, all those whose houses were destroyed because of the war, all those people who did not have home before the war. Now the burning question for them is, where are we going to live? And this war, actually, it provoked this huge housing crisis in Ukraine, thousands of buildings destroyed. And it also opened the window of opportunity for us to reevaluate our housing policy, to reevaluate our goals for the future. Because before the war, in Ukraine, the housing policy favored private ownership. And it means that some other alternative ways of housing provisions were actually overlooked, like social housing or private rental sector. These were the blind spots of Ukrainian housing policy. However, now the perception has changed, because now not only activists or researchers perceive housing as essential urban infrastructure, but also local governments. They perceive housing now as this essential infrastructure without which the cities cannot function. And it means that maybe in the future we will save this perception and build upon this perception of future housing policy. Also, not only perception, but also tenure structure has changed in Ukraine. For instance, we see that now the share of people who rent their homes have increased. And we anticipate that it will increase even more in the future. It means that those millions of people who will now rent their homes cannot be omitted anymore. They will need safe and regulated private rental structure. But also, housing, it has always been and it still remains a political question. It means that there are a lot of actors that have a lot of various interests in this sphere of housing. And it means that they will try to interfere with this housing policy. For instance, developers in Ukraine, they have been influencing housing policy for a long time. And sometimes even housing policy in Ukraine was actually called a construction policy. And they will try to benefit from this crisis. Just imagine, even before the war, these developers, they were eager to pour cement onto lakes, onto forests, to destruct architectural buildings. But now some of the cities are already partially destroyed. And they see this as an opportunity, because every crisis is an opportunity for them. And just an example, just days after the Sumy region was liberated from Russian forces, one of the Kiev developers, Andriy Vavrish, was photographed walking around the town, assessing the damage, and the title to the article said something like, "Architects are already planning the future of the Trostianets," and Trostianets is the name of the town. But I was taken aback a little bit by the speed with which those people are trying to promote their interests. And they will try to ride this wave of international finance that will come to Ukraine. And that is also our, I would say, task as a society to confront them and to say that there are also public interests, both in housing policy and in urban policy, and that those public interests have to dominate. And because of that, I think that also want to mention that, of course, housing policy is very much connected to urban policy. And this housing policy will take place in the cities for the most part. And it means that our cities will be a contested area, because in the cities, though all of those interests will clash and it will engage in this struggle. But also, cities are the places where movements, social movements, grassroots movements can emerge. And that is something that we have seen already in Ukraine. After 2014, the colleagues of mine from CEDOS, they were doing a research about urban grassroots initiative after the Euromaidan revolution. And they have actually seen that there was a growth in the number of these urban grassroots initiatives and organizations after the revolution. And I think that is something that will also happen after the war. And we have already seen that this is happening. When the war started, we have seen this huge wave of solidarity in Ukrainian cities. People were helping other people, unknown people, they were housing them, they were volunteering, donating. And I think that this is important to preserve this social solidarity after the war and to build our new policies, housing policies, urban policies, whatever policies, onto this solidarity. And this is also, for us, a question what future we want to see. Like, for instance, I want to see an affordable housing for everyone. And that should be something that we have to promote. And yeah, finally, what I wanted to say about Ukraine and about changes that we have seen is I wanted to talk about the way that we talk about Ukrainian cities and cities in general. Because also we have seen that there is this new academic and general interest towards Ukraine. And this is, of course, a double-edged sword, because on the one hand, it provides us with an opportunity to create this new grounded knowledge about Ukraine, about Ukrainian cities. On the other hand, it is very easy to lose Ukrainian voices into much of this interest. And that, I think, is something that we could not allow, to lose Ukrainian voices. We have to listen to Ukrainian people talking about Ukraine, because we have seen that some of Western researchers have failed to call a spade, to call a war, and it has to change. And not only to listen to Ukrainian voices about the topics connected to the war, because people from Ukraine could not only talk about the war, but they are experts in their own spheres, be it housing policy, be it urban policy, you name it. And that is something that I wish to see in the future, that this knowledge about Ukrainian cities will come from Ukrainians and from Ukraine, that this knowledge will be decolonized as well, and that is something that we can build upon. And I see this discussion and this conference as one of the many, many steps that we still have to make. Thank you, everyone, and I'll give back the floor to Michael.
So thank you very much to all of our speakers for giving us some very in-depth insights about the meaning of this war for Ukraine, not only today, but also in the future. And as you may have noticed, we moved from decolonization in the traditional sense to the more metaphorical version of decolonization, which we've been talking about quite a lot during this event in relation to knowledge production. And I think this travel that we took during the past 45 minutes is very much indicative of the challenges that we also face in general in urban studies. But forget about urban studies about Central and Eastern Europe now, because here we're talking anyway about Ukraine. Now, what happens next is that we declare the first act of this panel discussion concluded, and that will allow us to discuss more freely.